Hello everyone and welcome to WintellectNOW. One of the most important decisions you have to make when you start building applications is how you're going to go about architecting that app. Now, there are several ways you can do this, but what you have to consider when you start building an app is how am I going to separate the modules of my application? How am I going to separate my views from my models? How am I going to render my views? How am I going to get my views talking to my models? How am I going to glue those two together? How am I going to access data? Where am I going to store my data? And actually, how am I going to model my data? All these are important questions. And application architecture is the overall pattern that you employ in an application that kind of gives you the framework on which you hang those various entities, whether it be a model entity, whether it be a view entity, whether it be something in between, whether it be data access, whatever it may be. The application architecture kind of gives you the framework by which you do that. PHP is a kind of interesting language because it kind of came out of the procedural world, but it's also object-oriented. So if you wanted to build an application architecture that was more conducive towards procedural programs, you can do that. But if you also want to build an object-oriented app, you could do that as well. Well, in this video, we're going to look at kind of both. We're going to look at how you can actually use PHP in its kind of old school context as a procedural language, and then we're going to look at how you could use PHP as a object-oriented language to build MVC apps, and using two very popular frameworks. One is Smarty Templates and the other one is Cake PHP. PHP is almost as old as the World Wide Web is. World Wide Web came out in the early 90s, and it wasn't there that long after that PHP came out. And PHP has grown from its infancy into a full-blown object-oriented language. But early on, PHP allowed, and it still does to even this day, allows you to write PHP code in line with HTML. So you'll have an HTML code, and then you'll have a PHP block, and then that might do something, and then you might have some more HTML code, and then another PHP block. Now this might be fine for small applications, and in the early days of PHP, that's pretty much all we had was these basic processors. They weren't really doing a whole lot more than just processing forms and maybe shooting off emails and things like that. But since that time, we've gone on to write full-blown web applications, and so that inline PHP kind of creates issues with maintainability, especially when you end up with large applications, large robust, highly functional applications. It also violates object-oriented principles. As we moved into object-oriented programming with PHP, having all that embedded into HTML and code all embedded in a single file violated object-oriented principles of loose coupling and tight cohesion. So in response to that, people started thinking about how do we start building applications using these good OOP principles, or even these principles that are even applicable outside of the realm of object orientation, even in procedural program. People started thinking about how to build multi-tiered applications in PHP. Now, multi-tiered applications have been around a lot longer than PHP, but they typically manifest themselves in 3 layers, and this same thing is true inside of the PHP context as well. You have a presentation layer, which is a layer that controls the UI components. You have a business layer that controls the logic in the application, and you have a data layer that controls the data access in the application. And these are generally really stratified layers. The presentation layer talks to the business layer talks to the data layer, and you don't have a lot of presentation layers going directly to the data layer. And the reason we do it that way is so that we have nice segmentation between the layers, so that we have loose coupling between the layers, and we don't have tight cohesion, and then every layer is tightly cohesive in and of itself. And for lightweight and medium-sized applications, though, this paradigm of multi-tiered applications might lend itself well. And a good way to do that is to use a template engine, and we'll unpack what a template engine is in just a minute. But for large-scale applications, this is probably not a good way to do it. You would probably want to use something like MVC or an MV star platform like MVVM or MVP or MVPVM or something like that to actually do some kind of object-oriented approach to building an application where the separation of concerns is separated into models, views, and controllers, or something like that. So that'd be more conducive to large applications, and we'll unpack that later in the video. But first, I'm going to explore this multi-tier application using interior architecture and template engines. One way, as mentioned, for building layered applications in PHP context is to use a template engine. Now, a template engine is designed to separate markup from the underlying logic. In other words, your visual components from the underlying logic tiers. It also provides a utilities for creating common components such as forms, tables, and lists. So your template engine is not just a a template, but it also has some utility methods and functionality built into the engine that allow you to do some tasks that are rather repetitive rather easily just by putting some kind of directives into your templates. To accomplish this, template engines do basically 3 steps. First, the template engine provides a markup language to build templates. So you take this HTML, or if you're using something else, maybe even XML, and you take that that kind of markup, and then you combine it with the markup language that the engine uses to build a template. Now, the markup language contains the directives that you would need to tell the template where to stick particular values. It would also have directives for determining conditionals, like if you wanted to do candy row striping on your app or zebra striping on your application, you could put that kind of logic into the template engine, and then you could build a table, for instance, that has gray, white, or green, white, green, white. What happens next then is the logic tier will build an object or some kind of data structure, which is then passed off to the template. Now that object or data structure is going to have all the data that you want to actually display in the particular view that you're going to pass it off to. Now, this might be arbitrarily linked. So, again, going back to what the template engine provides you with is a way to sometimes even do looping over iterative data, such as lists or even trees in some cases. So then what happens lastly is the template is parsed, and the appropriate values are inserted into that template from the object that is passed to the template. And the template engine is the thing that's actually doing all that parsing and compiling of that template to build that final view that is then passed back to whatever's consuming it. In most cases, it's going to be a browser as HTML. Now, this is a fairly it seems like a no-brainer on that someone would actually come up with something like this. And for that reason, PHP has numerous template engines to choose from. One template engine that I really like to use is called the Smarty template engine. And this template engine has been around for a very long time. In fact, a friend introduced it to me long before PHP was an object-oriented language, and I started using it then and have loved it ever since. A Smarty template engine is powerful, it's mature, it's easy, and it's pretty easy to use. And it also gives a number of options in terms of configurability, performance, and debugging. So with the Smarty template engine, you can use it out of the box, and it's pretty straightforward, but you can also tweak it a little bit and get optimal performance out of your code. And it also has some neat features that you can turn on whenever you're debugging, and then you just disable them once you've got your template engine, once you have your application up and running. And using those different options within the Smarty template engine can increase your productivity and help you find problem areas inside of your application and what have you. And we'll look at some of these in our demo later on. The Smarty template engine will also take templates and compile them into PHP and then cache the opcode from the PHP compiler using caching frameworks that are available inside of PHP. Now, this can actually be used to improve the performance of your application rather than just using straight up PHP. If you were to actually use the Smarty template engine, you actually could end up with a faster application than you would otherwise because of the caching mechanisms that it uses, and it's smart enough to figure out when things change and what have you. So highly recommend checking out the Smarty template engine if you're interested in building multi-tier applications using PHP. And now, I don't know that I would use the Smarty template engine for building large applications, and we'll talk about how we can do that later. But for small and mid-weight applications, I think this is a great tool for building those kind of applications, and the learning curve is not that bad at all. On this slide, we're seeing a few code snippets from how we go about building a Smarty template. The first code snippet up there is just HTML. You see that I have just a title tag inside of that. Now, this is probably the most basic kind of template you could build using the Smarty template engine. But you can kind of see how it works. I have that template would be in one file, and then inside of my logic tier, if you want to call it that, what I would do is I would assign a variable call to the title, and then I'd give it PHP template demo. And then I would call the actual the template that's actually going to display that. And this one I'm calling photo.tpl. That's the template extension. And then that will actually take that new Smarty object that I created right there, and then use that apply that particular template to it and generate a view from it. So it's fairly straightforward. You can see how the logic is working out here, and the code that's contained inside of that photo.tpl would be that head with the title tag there. So that is how you would go about building a Smarty template most basically. Well, we're going to look at one in our demo next that's a little bit more involved than just this right here. In this demo, we're going to look at some code that actually uses the Smarty template engine, and I'm going to show you how that code would actually look, and then we're going to see how that code actually functions whenever we get on the backside when I actually pull up the code, pull up that page that's generated in a browser, and then I'm going to turn on some of the debug options just to show you what it looks like and how you can use the Smarty template engine to get some kind of metrics on your application. Okay, you can see here now that I have my code pulled up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the actual file structure first whenever we start building out these applications. Now, here's the root folder. And in my root folder, I have two folders. I have libs and I have photos. Now, the photos is the actual application that I'm building. That's my application. I'm going to build an application that just displays photos on a web page using a template engine. And the libs, it actually contains all of the code for the actual Smarty template engine, and you can see here I don't need to load all of this other than just make a reference to this Smarty class right here, which we will do inside of our code. But here inside of my photos, I have several different photo files, and this is kind of the folders that make up the application that uses the Smarty template engine. Here's my index.php. That's just the default page that's called, and then this contains all the code that points to the actual library folders, a few folders up, and we'll see that pointer in a second when we look at the code. And then I have this templates folder, and this is where I'm actually going to stash all of my templates. And in here I have 3 different templates. I have a what one you could call a body of the page, and a photo.template, a header, and a footer. So if I wanted to, with the template engine, you can actually have, like, if I wanted to add a different body element, so to speak, I could have photos, I could have a text TPL, and it used the same header and footer as another template. So you can kind of recycle some of the template elements between different templates. You don't have to have identical. You don't have to have a lot of code reduplication inside of your templates, because it allows you to build essentially the same concept as server-side includes, if you're familiar with that. But now that we've seen the folder structure, let's flip back over to the code and see what this actually looks like. The first thing I want to do, though, is walk through the actual template itself. Okay. Now you can see here, this is, like I said, this is the body template, and you can see here I have a reference to a configuration file, and that's contained within the config folder that we saw inside of the application folder a minute ago. I'm including a reference to header.tpl, which is inside of the template folder, and then a reference to the footer TPL down here. And then in the middle of these two, I have a section here that does some work to actually build out the view for some of these photos that I'm going to be displaying. So you can see here, I have some directives that tells the template engine that I want to actually do some loop over something called photos. And inside of this, I'm declaring a few different directives here, and I'm building an image here, and then I'm telling that I want its source to be located to something that's in the name parameter that's going to be that I'm actually going to be building inside of my logic tier in just a second. So, and here all I'm doing is I'm displaying, this is giving me a URL to the image that's contained in an image folder. This is displaying a name of that image, and then this is down here is just getting the height and width and displaying that on the screen. So you can see here I've got a reference to section 1 here, and then I'm looping over some variable called photos, and then I'm using photos section 1.name to actually get the value. And you'll see how that maps onto the object that I'm going to be passing into this template whenever I look at the code over here in my index.php. Okay, now that we've looked at the template, you kind of see how that's working. we're going to look at the actual code here inside of this particular PHP file. You see here I have a reference to the Smarty template engine. That's required, so I actually can use this. And then I create a new Smarty template class, and then I'm populating the title. Now, over here in my header, this is where I have that simple populate the title tag here, and that's where that variable is going to be stashed whenever I call my template. And so I'm just assigning a value to a tag called title, and I'm saying PHP template demo. And then here's a couple of different things that you can do to configure it. You can force it to compile the templates, or you can force it. You don't have to do this if you just want to interpret them every time. And the interpretation is actually slower, but if you force to compile, then it'll actually compile it in actual PHP code, and then actually can build opcode out of that, and it can actually cache that opcode and get much faster performance. And if I set caching to true, it will actually take some of those that compiled PHP code and cache it, and then it will actually, you can build some kind of caching mechanism that can actually increase your performance here. And then I'm setting a cache lifetime. So that's some of what you can do with some of the caching mechanisms inside of the template engine itself. Now you notice I have the debugging turned off right now. I'm going to enable that in a minute after I load this for the first time to show you what kind of metrics you can get through the debug panels that the Smarty template engine gives you. Now, what I'm doing in this code here is I'm doing something that's pretty easy, pretty simple. I'm just going to a directory and getting files out of that directory and getting properties about that file. So I'm just going over here. I'm getting a list of files, and then I'm saying if the file is not a dot, is dot, which in other words it's not a dot or a double dot for navigating directories. I'm just going to assume it's a picture, and then I'm getting the image size of that, and then I'm doing an array push here onto a variable called data, which is just an array, and then I'm pushing on some properties to build an associative array called name, and then I'm assigning it the file name, height, assigning the height to it, and I'm assigning the width to another width there. So I'm just building an associative array of 3 parameters, name, height, and width, and then just pushing that onto the array. And then I'm taking that array, and that's going to be my data object that I'm going to pass off to the template, and I'm going to assign that array of data to another property called photos. And you remember from when we looked back at our photo.template here, you notice here I have photos, this photos variable. Well, that photos is a reference to this particular variable here. So I'm taking that data array and assigning it to this photos variable for my template to parse. And then I'm actually calling up that photo.tpl, that photo template, and I'm saying use this data inside of this template, and then it's going to generate my view that way. So let's flip over to Chrome and see what this actually looks like. So I've already got it pulled up here. You can see here that I'm looping over a directory of files, and I'm just generating some images on a screen, and that's what that looping was doing inside of the template. And then I've got some CSS to mark this up so that it makes it look, makes it kind of responsive, what have you. And then so you can use all the classic HTML that you would use, HTML tricks and CSS tricks that you would use otherwise to build out your views otherwise in HTML, HTML5, whichever you're using. And you can even do things with JavaScript and all that cool stuff. So that's the template engine and how it works. But let's turn on the debugging just so you can see what's going on inside of that. What it's going to do is it's actually going to pop up a window. So I commented out that line, uncommented that line there. Oops, need to add a dollar sign there because that won't work. Let's go back over here and reload this, and you can see here that it loaded up a pop-up window, and then you can see here what's going on, and it shows you compile times, it can show you what file called it, it says cache, and it shows you the scope of the variables, and then it shows you the array that it parsed and what have you, and then everything that it assigned, and then it kind of gives you some metrics on how long it took to do all of that stuff. So this is a really nice debug window for kind of figuring out where the bottleneck in your application may be, or how long it actually takes to compile some of the code. Or if you have some kind of looping schemes going on, you can see where the bottlenecks, especially if you have complex templates and that are, templates calling templates calling templates and what have you. You can kind of use these debug tools here to show you the performance metrics of each one of those, and you can see the data that's being passed in and all of that. So this is a kind of a useful window for getting those kind of metrics for debugging in any application. So this is what the Smarty template engine can do for you, and with it you can generate some really nice looking applications, and use all the CSS and HTML to your heart's content. Or if you want to get real fancy, you could even build things like JSON or even XML using that if you wanted to. But most of the time it's going to be used within the context of building HTML views for applications. Now that we've talked about how to build layered applications in PHP, I want to switch gears and talk about MVC for the remainder of the video. MVC stands for Model View Controller, and this is a popular application architecture that lends itself well to separation of concerns, low coupling, and tight cohesion. And as we've seen already, you can kind of accomplish that if you're doing a procedural style programming with something like a template engine and with interior architecture. But this one is particularly lends itself well in object-oriented programming because of some of the things that you can do in object-oriented programming that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do if you're just building some kind of procedural program. Now, I'm going to talk through what the MVC architecture is first before we start looking at some code, just so we can kind of have a working definition of what exactly MVC stands for and what each of the components are. You can see here I have a diagram that has 3 circles on it, and each one of those circles represents a particular component of the application: the model, the view, and the controller. And then within that box is really what the application would be. And then on the outside of the box we have a user that's going to be interacting with this application. The model contains the actual components of the applications that represent the data, and these are your domain model, which is all your objects that relate to the actual application that you're trying to design. For instance, if I was building a financial app, it would contain all my things related to account objects. It would contain transaction objects, deposit objects. If I had a ledger, I would have a ledger object, and then I could have things hanging off that ledger object, and I would have an object-oriented model that's kind of represented in that domain that I have the circle model labeled as. And also within that model you would have your data access as well. You would have some way of loading data either from a web service or from a database or a file, whatever that may be. What happens when something changes in the model is it will actually update the view. So if I have the model change under the hood, say something loaded on a server and then a web service published something back to my model, then I want to tell the user that something changed. So what the model will do is then inform a view that something did in fact change. Now this is usually done through a subscriber publisher pattern or an observer pattern, whichever, it's called different things in different contexts, but what happens is the view will actually subscribe to the model, and that's going to be usually brokered by the controller, but the view will subscribe to the model, and then when the model does something, it will publish it back to the view, and then you get low coupling between these two components because of that pattern. So when something happens in the model, it will update the view. Now what happens next is the user sees the view. So he sees or hears or whatever sense that the view is actually publishing, the user will then pick that queue up and then will respond to the view by clicking on some button, filling out a form, doing some action on the view that will then invoke something in the controller. Now the controller contains all the code that receives actions from the view. Now the view is it's thin as it receives updates from the model, but it also passes actions back down to the controller. So it's just kind of a middle an agent for doing that. So the controller is actually going to do a lot more of the interpreting of that action. So if they click a button and that button invokes some kind of get method that goes out and gets some kind of data, well, the controller then is going to say, okay, I'm going to interpret that get method to do something in the model, and then the model and the controller is going to change something in the model. So you can see here I've kind of got a circle going on here where I have a controller pushing data updates to the model and things happening there, things in the model updating views, things in the views getting posted back to the user, and the user then is interacting again with the controller. Now, some might think that this how do you get this all connected? Well, usually the model and the view inherently don't talk to one another, and whenever I load an application they won't talk to one another inherently. So what has to happen is that has to be brokered by the controller. So sometimes you'll have the controller changing the view, and what that means is that it's going to have that view loaded, and then it's going to have a model loaded, and then it's going to connect those two together so that you can have a view that is going to be subscribed to the model so that it can actually receive those updates from the view. Now this is a kind of a basic understanding of model view and controller. Now if you look up different diagrams you'll see it drawn differently, but the basic idea is that you have a separation of concerns between what the user sees and what the user does. That what the user sees is what happens in the view, and then the view will actually invoke things in the controller, and so the controller is what takes those actions and then does something in the model. So, and the model is what does a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of business logic and business rules and data access. So you can kind of see how that's working here in this diagram. PHP has a number of MVC frameworks to choose from. There's probably dozens of them out there, some of them better than others. The one that we're going to talk about is called Cake PHP, and we'll unpack it in a minute, but I want to talk about in general what you can do with these and kind of where we're going with this. MVC frameworks provide an application shell for building out apps. As the name implies, it's a framework. It's not a full-blown application in of itself, but it does contain some of the necessary elements and some of the redundant elements that you would have in an application, where you just have to go in and kind of fill in the gaps, so to speak, or if you're doing it from the analogy of a house, you have the foundation and the frame, but you got to decide where you're going to put in the rooms, and then what color you're going to paint the walls and what have you. So you got to finish it out. The MVC framework itself, though, provides a number of functions that are true for every application that you would ever write using the MVC framework within the context of PHP. And like any MVC framework, there is a learning curve to understanding the idiosyncrasies of any given framework. In other words, you got to sit down with an MVC framework and kind of hammer it out and figure out what's going on inside that framework in order to really understand the framework, and before you can even begin to start building apps in that framework. So I don't get frustrated with these things right when you download them and you don't have an application in 10 minutes, because I'll be honest with you, you're not going to have that. But I think if you take the time and learn one of them, you will see how it'll pay off in dividends later on down the road if you'll take the time up front to actually learn some of these MVC frameworks and how well they actually do work, and how they will lend themselves to building applications, and very robust applications, I might add. Cake PHP, in my mind, is the penultimate PHP MVC framework, and I think there's a number of reasons why, but I want to introduce this particular MVC framework, and I'm going to use the remainder of the video to kind of give you a primer on how to get this up and running so you can start building applications using the MVC architecture inside of PHP using Cake PHP. Now, Cake PHP is a feature-rich application framework aimed at rapid application development. And the way it accomplishes that is it offers a lot of automation that many redundant tasks such as that automates many redundant tasks such as data access and data binding. So what you can do with the PHP application is you just focus in on writing out your model and your controllers, and even some of that is somewhat automated for you. So all you have to do is kind of fill in the blanks and the rest of the sentence is already there for you, so to speak. And PHP does have a learning curve. I'm not gonna lie to you and say that it's easy to do. It's rather steep, and I'm not gonna blush at that. But I think once you get your head around using Cake PHP, the payoff will be that you'll have A, well-built applications, and two, the future speed in actually building out apps using this framework will be much greater than if you were actually writing most of the app from scratch. So without further ado, let's dive in and start looking at how to build an MVC app using Cake PHP. The first thing you'll want to do in setting up an app is to actually go out and get Cake PHP from Cake PHP's website at cakephp.org, and then extract that into the root folder of your web server, whatever web server you're using. I'm going to be using XAMPP, and XAMPP is XAMPP, and you can go out there and download that web server if you don't already have one. Now, XAMPP is nice because it bundles Apache, MySQL, and PHP all in one installer, and you just run the installer and everything that's necessary to run Cake PHP is already available for you. And so it's really nice because then all I have to do is extract the Cake PHP framework, and then I'm ready to start working on it. You'll also have to have PDO enabled for MySQL, and this can be enabled inside of the php.ini file, and you can go down, it's an extension that you have to enable. I have instructions on how to enable extensions in my introduction video on PHP, so if you're not familiar with that, I'd recommend going out there and checking that out. Also, if you're not familiar with PDO, PDO stands for PHP Data Objects, and again, this is something that's used by Cake PHP under the hood. I would encourage you to go check out my video on data access in PHP before proceeding in this video to kind of get a idea of what's going on with PDO and how that actually works, so you can understand what Cake PHP is actually going to be doing under the hood for you. So before we proceed, I would recommend doing that if you haven't already done so. Second, you want to configure your database in MySQL before proceeding in Cake PHP as well. And Cake PHP actually has some naming conventions that they recommend that you use to save work downstream. So a lot of the automation is built around how you actually name columns and create tables inside of your database. And so what they'll want you to do is use an auto-incremented ID field and then set that as the primary key. And then it also wants you to add two fields called created and modified, and these are date time fields. So with these three fields, you want to put those in every table so that Cake PHP can use those to tell what's been updated and when things were created and modified and what have you, and uniquely identify data that way. And once you have your tables created, I'm actually going to look at how to do this in a minute. I'm not just going to mention it. Once you have your data, your tables created, you can go into the app folder wherever you extracted your Cake PHP framework, go to the database.php default, edit that, and then save it as database.php, and edit those settings for your MySQL database. Then you want to go in and change the app security. There's a few settings inside of the app root utilities debugger, things that have to be set, and once you get those things set, you'll be ready to start building your application. In this demo, what we're going to look at is what we talked about on the last slide is actually how to go about setting up Cake PHP and get that up and running. And once we have that up and running, we'll actually start building an application. So I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about the process of getting a Cake PHP app ready to go. Okay, now that I've got my Windows Explorer pulled up here, I'm going to browse out to where I've got my XAMPP install, and that's going to be on my root. I have XAMPP installed right here, and then I'm going to open that up. And then inside of here I have my htdocs folder. And in my htdocs folder, this is my web root for this particular install. So I'm going to open that up, and you'll see I have two folders here. One's called Cake and one's called Cake 2. I'm using Cake 2 later to show you how you can extend Cake, PHP Cake, but this is the one that I've installed for my root. Now inside of here, I'm going to open this up, and you can see here I have several folders, okay? And inside of this folder, I have a number of things going on here, but the one that I'm going to be mostly concerned with is this folder called app, and this is the actual application folder where I'm going to be doing most of my work, and this is the one that I actually want to build out and build out my model views and controllers. So I'm going to open that up, and you can see here I have several folders. I have a model folder, a view folder, and a controller folder. And that's where I'm going to be actually sticking in my classes for whenever I start building out my application using models, views, and controllers to get the MVC framework. So I wanted to throw that out there first, and so you can kind of see what's going on inside of the folder structure here. While I'm here, I want to go out there and actually change those security settings I was talking about. Now if I go back up to the root here and I go to lib, cake, and then I go to utility, open up this debugger.php, and I'm going to open that up in Notepad++. Actually, I already have it open. At the very bottom of that file, you have two variables that you need to set, and one of them is the security salt, and one of them is the security cipher seed. Now you just want to change these to something other than the default values. Now you can do that just by inserting you're replacing some of the characters in this side of the salt with some that you just randomly choose, or you can generate a completely new one. And the same thing with the cipher seed down here. You could just replace some of the digits here with some that you randomly choose, or you could go out there and do that. Use an actual cipher seed generator and replace that number with a one from a cipher seed generator. But either way, as long as it's unique to your app, then that's all you have to do inside of this debugger .php to make these unique to your application. Once you're done with that, go ahead and save it, and then we can flip over and start working on our database. But before I do that, I'm going to start up XAMPP and get that up and running. So if I go over here to XAMPP, I'm going to load my XAMPP control panel and then start my Apache and my SQL server. Since I don't have these installed as services, I have to start them manually. And then once I have that up and running, I'm going to flip over to localhost, go to XAMPP, and then I'm going to go down here to my PHP MyAdmin, and this is going to kind of be my management console for all my databases here. You can see I have several databases already installed on here. The one I'm going to be most interested here though is my photos database. Now, this is the one I'm going to be using for my demonstrations here on this particular application we're going to be working with. And I just have one table in this, and I have this table called photos. And like I said, what you want to do is create a table structure that looks something like this. You want to have an ID field right here. And the ID field is just an auto-incremented int, and that gives the database a primary key to use, and it also allows you to identify objects using a unique identifier that way inside of your application. And it wants you to create this created and modified field as well within the context of all your tables inside of Cake PHP. So whenever you update these records or you insert new records, it will actually populate these two values using whatever the timestamp is at that particular time. And most of the time these are going to be the same, because in this application when I create it, it's also the last time I modify that as well. And then outside of those three columns, I actually have three columns that I'm using to house my data. I have a name field, a description field, and then a photo field, and this is just a medium-sized blob inside of MySQL. The reason I chose a blob here is because I want to do something that's a little bit more than just basic text, and there's some challenges when you're actually dealing with binary data that make you have to do things a little bit different than just the default behaviors inside of Cake PHP, and I did that on purpose, and you'll see why later down the road, but just keep that in the back of your mind. I do have binary data in this database. You could reasonably have a folder that you store these in as files rather than storing them as binary large objects inside of the database. But either way, you can do that. Some people would argue for it, some would argue against it. In this case, I'm actually just storing the photos in the database. The last thing I want to do is actually update my database settings inside of my application so they'll actually work with this new database that I've created called Photos. I'm going to come over here and I'm actually going to open up this Windows Explorer instance here, and I'm going to come back over here to the root, go back to App, and then go back down to the config here. And you can see I have a database default. This one contains the default settings, and once you open this up, you can come down here and it will actually I'll mention this in passing first. You can actually use this with MySQL, SQLite, Postgre, or SQL Server 2005 or higher. So it does support multiple database instances, all using the PDO library. So again, I'd recommend going out and checking out that PHP and data access video and see how PHP data objects can access those different types of databases. Once you get that down there, once you get that done though, you want to come down to the bottom of this and actually set up your database file. So it actually points to your database. So here I'm using database MySQL and I'm pointing it to localhost, and I don't have a password in this. I'm just logging in as root, and my database is photos. Now you wouldn't want to save that as default php.default. You want to save it as database.php. That way the actual app will pick that up. And here's my actual configuration here. You can see this is the one that I'm actually going to be using for the application. So the default just contains empty values here, but if you're actually using something other than MySQL, you can configure this and it'll work the same way. It doesn't change anything about how the application will behave otherwise, just where you store the data. And if you like my MS SQL better than MySQL, then fine, go ahead and use that. There's nothing that would hold you back from using SQL Server over MySQL in that instance. And if you're more comfortable using SQL Server, then by all means do that. MySQL just seems to work really well in the PHP environment, so I kind of use that as the default server unless I need to use SQL Server for something else. But that's how you would go about setting up configuring the database settings here. Now that we've got everything set up, I'm going to start talking about how to just set up a basic model class, a basic view class, and a basic controller class, and then we're going to just use the default behaviors inside of CakePHP to show you how much you actually do get when you just out of the box, how much you actually do get. So if I wanted to set up a model, all I'd have to do is go open a new PHP file, create the file, and then just say class photo extends app model, and then it's a completely empty class. And what that's going to do is actually inherit everything from the base model class inside of CakePHP, which is all of the data access components for accessing data, and also a lot of searching capabilities, a lot of other things that we'll see later on when we actually start using this model class inside of a controller. But you can do searches, you can do saves, you can do updates, and what have you using this model class without having to write a single line of code. Now, if you wanted to extend this, you can do that and add properties and do other kinds of things that are more business rules oriented inside of this class and as your app dictates, but out of the box you get a lot of functionality for free using CakePHP. Next thing that we're going to want to do is configure a view. Now a view is you're going to have to actually manually build some kind of view whenever you start dealing with this, because this is actually going to be more how it's going to look and feel inside of your application once you actually get that going. Now views are stored in a views folder under a particular object name, so you'll actually have a folder within the views folder that contains all the various views for a given object. So I'm dealing with one object in my application here, and it's a photo object. And what I can do with that photo object is I can have a single view, or I can have a view that represents multiple instances of that same object, such as a list of photos. And here you can see in my little code snippet here that I'm actually using a for each loop to build out a view that would contain a div that contains some properties about that particular photo. So you can see here again I'm using something that's similar to a template engine that we've seen already, but this is actually more raw PHP that we're looking at here. And what have you. Now the truth of the matter is if you wanted to, you could actually use a template engine inside of your view. If you so desired to do that, you could go out and extend CakePHP and add template engines, even Smarty templates if you wanted to, and extend and mix those two different libraries inside of a single application. Now is that necessary? No, absolutely not. In fact, I don't know that I would do that or even recommend doing that, because Smarty templates it does a lot of stuff. There's a lot of overlap between what CakePHP does and what Smarty templates is going to give you out of the box as well. So just kind of throw that out there as an idea, just because you're using an MVC framework doesn't mean that you're locked into the framework, because you're still using PHP under the hood, so you can do other things with PHP that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do with just using the Cake PHP framework. Cake PHP also has default views, and what I mean by default views is everything that's not particular to a particular object. So in the last slide we saw stuff that related to a photos object. We had, you know, name, description, and then maybe the binary data, what have you, to that in that object represented in that view. But if I wanted something like that dealt with the header, or something that dealt with the footer, or something that wanted to load CSS, or something to load JavaScript, now I'm not going to include that in my photo specific view. And so what I have to do to load that kind of stuff is have something, and that is a default view. And those are housed in the views layout folder, and there's the default view is called default.ctp. Now what you can do inside that default CTP is the actual one that comes with Cake PHP has a lot of debug code that you can use to actually show you what's going on inside of your actual Cake PHP project. But what you can do is take that same default.ctp and then copy it over, remove that debug code, and actually build out your own view to make it a production-oriented view. And so in debug, you could just swap out the debug view, and then you can have a debug view for debugging. And then when you're ready to turn it on to production, you swap it out for a production default view. And so you can just have several default views depending on what you're actually doing, and you can store all those inside of your views layout folder there, and they'll still leverage all of the other object specific views underneath the hood once you start using Cake PHP. Now that we've talked about views and we've talked about models for a second, I'm going to talk about controllers. Controllers are housed underneath the app root. When I say the app root, that app folder in the application under a controllers folder. Now the controllers specify, you know, helpers that can be custom or default to control input and output. And, you know, in other words, Cake PHP can receive stuff from the browser, and it can also post stuff back to the browser. And these helper controllers are the things that kind of help translate data into an output, or translate data from an input form into objects. So they're kind of those mediators between what the view gives you, or what you're sending back to the view, and what your actual objects are. Now inside of your actual object controllers, when you create a class, you have to declare what kind of helpers you're using. In this case, I'm going to be using HTML and form helpers because I'm writing a web application. Now, every controller has to have what we call an index function, and the index function is essentially the default behavior for any controller. And in the instance of this particular controller is for photos, what I want to do is I'm just going to I'm going to go out there and actually search for all of the photos that I have in my, you know, database or my data store. That's what I'm doing right here. So what I'm loading up inside of this is I'm actually loading a photos controller. So I say this.photo.find all. I'm telling that photo model that I created earlier that I want to find all of the photos that it can find in the data store, and that's all handled by Cake PHP. I don't have to write a single line of code to go do that, and it's going to go out there to the database, load all those all that data up into objects, and then send that back to me. And then by default, what I'm going to do then is get the actual photos view from, and then it's going to use that photos view to actually parse that data that was loaded from this photos.find method here. So that I get for free out of the box with PHP with very minimum code, and it will actually do a lot for you. And we're going to extend this in a little bit, but what I wanted to do is show you what you can get for free out of the box using Cake PHP. In this demo, what I want to look at is the results of the last few slides that we've been talking about. I want to open up the code and just look briefly at the code, and then flip over to a browser and show you what the results of that code would look like. Okay, the first thing I want to look at is, let's go ahead and look at that model that I had. Now, I called that model photo, and it's a very basic class. It has literally nothing in it because everything it's getting is getting it from the app model, and then the map model actually extends from the model. So under the hood, it's actually just going back. This is just using the bare minimum functionality that Cake PHP gives you out of the box, which is actually quite a bit. If you go out there and look at the documentation, it does a lot of searching and updating and other types of things that you can do with all the data inside of this this model class here. Next, I'm going to flip over to the actual view, and now the view, I'm going to look at the view first here, but notice I called this view index.ctp, and this is actually located under a app view photos index.ctp. Views are going to map onto the various functions inside of your controller. So this index.ctp here maps onto this index function here. So this is kind of my default functionality for the app. So whenever this controller gets called, it's going to go to, and I don't specify anything for the particular photos controller, it's going to load the indexed view, and then in this one I'm just saying get everything, and then it's going to call this index.ctp, and this is actually what it's going to use for the default function, default view that I'm calling. And this index.ctp is actually going to be leveraged by the default.ctp. Now this one is the default one from the actual Cake PHP. I've got a lot of the code commented out. You notice I have HTML comment codes right here. The reason I did that is because I put the entire view encapsulated inside of this single view here. You notice I've got headers and CSS and all that. Now, when in my final version of this application, I would probably separate all of that code out into the actual default view and make that a production view. But what I can do here is I can actually enable some of this, and then this will actually tell me all of the debug information that I would otherwise need to have, like errors and what have you. And you can see it's doing a lot for me. It's doing fetching metadata, it's fetching the CSS, it's fetching scripts, and these are all defined inside of my setup files inside of this application. And I would encourage you to go out there and read the documentation on where that is housed. But anyways, once I have all that done, what's going to be loaded is it's going to go to this content here, and that's actually what's actually going to load that particular view for whatever I'm doing, and based on the controller that's being called, and that's what it's going to load into the space here. It's going to replace that line with whatever the content is that is being loaded from the particular controller, and so it's going to load that index CTP for this particular application and then display that to the screen. So, and then I'm going to flip over to my controller here and show you what's going on. And we've seen this already. I'm just going out to the database, getting all the photos and loading those into objects, and then taking that over to this index.ctp and then looping over those objects. And you notice these fields have the same name as the actual columns in the database, and that's how it's able to use that name and description and automate all of that using these naming conventions that we're able to share across the database, inside the code and what have you, and inside the view. So that's how it's able to automate a lot of this for us. So if you're consistently naming things, you can get a lot of the work done for free using the Cake PHP framework without having to write a single line of code. So let's flip open a browser and let's load this up and see what it looks like. Now, I don't think it's actually going to load anything pretty, but I'm going to go Photos, and we should see an array of photos. But you notice they're all blank here, and the reason I did that is because that's binary. It's trying to load something that's not available yet. I haven't written a controller that will actually take that binary data and translate it into something useful. And because I can't, because an image is actually a different request, I actually have to write a different controller. And this is going to segue right into my next segment of this video, where I'm actually going to try and extend this little application I've got here to actually do some of this stuff to make those photos show up, and then actually upload a photo to this particular look here, and so you can add to it and take away from it and what have you. I don't think I have the takeaway working, but anyways, you can see how you can interact with the Cake PHP framework using forms, and you can use the data in the database to actually build out a nice looking view here. Now that we've talked about the basic functionality of Cake PHP, I want to talk about extending this a little bit. Now, you notice here I have a root URL. I have example.com/photos. You notice that when I pull up my demo, I typed in my localhost /cake/photos. What I was doing is I was telling the photos with that photos parameter, I was actually telling it what controller I want to use. I'm using the photos controller. So it takes that parameter and then appends controller to it, and then that's how it knows what class to use under the hood. Then the following parameter, you notice I have show. Now this show parameter is what I'm actually going to use to show an actual image. I'm going to actually pass the binary data as a view back to the browser, and then it's going to take that show that binary data, interpret that as an actual JPEG. But what you can do is, with that first parameter, you specify the actual controller class that you're going to be using, photos controller. That second one is actually going to be the method name that you're going to call. And then anything after that method name is what they would call the action in Cake PHP speak, is going to be the parameters that you're going to pass into that particular function in the controller. So if I go photos/show and then I say 123, I'm saying show photo 123, and that 123 is going to map on to that ID parameter inside of this. So if I had two parameters, I go /123/parameter XYZ, and then that would map onto the second parameter, and so on. So that's how you would pass parameters into these particular functions inside of your controller here. So that's kind of how they figure out that's how they're doing the actual controllers, mapping the controllers and the routing from a URL onto a controller inside of Cake PHP. And if you're using those URLs consistently like that, you can actually build out a fairly robust controller and have a very nice, pretty URL as well. In this demo, we're actually going to look at the results of an extended controller. You notice I had that show controller on there. We're going to look at the meat of that and see what's going on there. And then we're going to look at another extended controller, and it's going to actually receive an upload and show you how you can interact with forms using Cake PHP as well. So without further ado, let's flip over to the code and then look at that, and then we'll see it in action. Now I've got my model view controller pulled up for my extended version of this, and you notice I have Cake 2 out here. This is my extended model view and controller. First I wanted to show you the model here. I hadn't changed anything on it because the default functionality that Cake PHP gives me is sufficient for the application that I'm writing here. So the model I get out of the box in Cake PHP offers a lot of functionality, so I don't have to write any kind of additional code under the hood using in this model. It actually is really convenient for that matter. And over here in my view, I've actually taken all that header HTML and footer HTML, and I've actually abstracted it out of this file and put it into that default view, and then created a debug view and then a production view, and then this one I'm actually going to see the production view. That's actually going to call this particular view. But I also added a form here. Now in Cake PHP you can actually automatically build forms as well, but in the case for this demo I actually built the form manually. But you can either do either one of those. Either one of them is fine inside of Cake PHP. But this form will actually will upload a binary image to the server, and then it will actually insert that image into the database, and I'm going to look at the code that does that in just a second. But I also want you to look at what I'm doing here as well. Notice I set the source here to photos.show. Now that photos is relative to the root of this, so if I go Cake 2 and I say photos/show, what I'm telling this to do is I'm telling it to call the photos controller and use the show action. Remember that URL here, and then I'm actually spitting out that ID for the photo here, and that's how I'm actually going to be able to call a controller inside of my photo controller here, which is this function here. Notice I'm using the same index controller here, controller method, but here I've got the show method here that's receiving that ID field back whenever is called. So I'm actually, the browser is seeing that image tag, and then it's looking at the source URL for that image tag, and then it's calling the source of that image tag is actually going to invoke the photo controller, and then invoke the show method, and then it's going to pass in that ID that I put into that photo controller there, that URL. And then what I'm doing with that is I'm using the model that I get for free from CakePHP, and I'm using that find method again. But this one I'm using a parameterized find method, and this is all documented inside of the CakePHP documentation. But this one I'm looking for the first instance where a condition matches, where ID is set to the ID variable that I'm passing into this method, and then that's going to find me the first one. And then what I'm going to get out of that is I'm going to get the binary data. Remember, I named that the binary data photo in my database, and then I'm going to set the response body to that photo data. That's just raw binary data. I'm not doing anything other than just posting it back to the response body. Then I'm setting the type of the response to JPEG. But because I don't want it to render a view, I just want it to pass the raw data back, I'm just going to say return the response. So what CakePHP does is it sees that I passed back a response. It's interpreting that as, hey, I don't want you to render a view. I want you to use this response instead, because I manually built that using the controller, and it's just going to spit back whatever's back in that response back to the browser. And in this instance, it's just raw binary data, which I want it to do so those photos render correctly. Now down here is where I'm handling an upload. This is my upload method. So if I call photos/upload, I'm going to call this controller method. And what I'm checking for is this a post or not? In other words, I'm looking for the action. If it's a post, is it a put, is it a get, is it an update, is it delete, whatever it may be, whatever HTTP verb I'm calling. In this case, I'm looking for a post for multi-part form data. Now, if I wasn't using binary data, I wasn't using multi-part form data, I could just call this method, this one line of code here, this.photos.save, and then pass in the actual data. CakePHP is smart enough to figure out what data goes where inside of the database based on the form names that I gave those the form elements inside of the HTML. Those map onto the database column names, and so all I have to do is call the controller save and then pass in the data object. But since I'm dealing with binary data, I can't do that. I have to massage it a little bit, and that's because the way PHP does binary data. Just because I'm dealing with the MVC framework doesn't mean that I don't have full access to everything under the hood concerning PHP as well. So I can use PHP stuff to get out data here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to use that controller object, that model object again, and call the set method in the model, and I'm going to call set the name, and I'm going to set the description straight off the request, and that's just plain old text data. But what I have to do next is get the binary data in the database. The way PHP handles binary data is it just takes the binary data from a multi-part form encoded data and writes it to a temp file, and then gives you the path through the temp file. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just getting the temp file name, opening that file up, reading that into the variable here, and then I'm setting that variable, setting the photos column to that variable here. I could probably skip a line and just write that straight into the photo there, but for clarity I did it that way. Closing that up and then just calling save after I've populated all of that data. And if I actually set an ID, I could actually update a photo if I wanted to, but I'm actually going to insert one because I didn't specify an ID. But I don't have to call a separate method for that. I just call it save, and it does everything, either does an insert for new data or an update for old data. And then notice again, I'm not calling a controller, a view here, because there's no view, really a view for an upload. I'm going to do a redirect back to another view. So in this case, I want to redirect it back to the default photos view. And in this case, all I'm going to do is redirect it back to the photos here, and then that's going to again invoke this index controller method, and just use the default view that way. So that way I don't have to build a custom view for uploads as well. I can just use an existing one, and then anything that I changed will show up again because I'm searching for all my photos. So here I have 3 controller methods, but I really only have 1 view. Just because I don't have a view for every controller doesn't mean that I can't have multiple controller methods. So I don't have one-to-one correlation between everything that's going on, but nevertheless I can still build a controller and have a view, and then I have a model, and most of that I get for free anyways because I'm using CakePHP. So let's flip over to Chrome and see what this actually looks like. So here I've got it already pulled up, and you can see here now that I've got these photos and they're actually displaying now, and that's because I'm actually using that view code. So I'm going to view the page source to show you what's going on. And that view is just getting replicated over and over again using divs. And then you notice here I'm calling photos show, and I'm passing in an ID. So I'm calling that photos controller, invoking the show method, and then I'm giving it an ID parameter there. And so that's exactly what's going on as I'm just loading, a file ID number 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, etc., etc. So if I wanted to invoke that upload controller, here I've got this form down here. I'll look for a file, I'll give it a name and a description. So let's go down here and look at what's going on here. You notice here I've got that same photos controller, and I'm going to invoke the upload method, and then I've got those parameter names, photo name and description, and then and it's going to post it back as multi-part form data. So let's try this out, and let's find a file here. Which one of these have I not used? I don't know. I think I've used all of them at one point. Let's select this Stormy Skies here and open this file up. I'm going to call this Stormy Skies. It's already tested this, I suppose so. Stormy before a shower, and I'm going to hit upload, and let's see if that posts back. It's going to upload a photo, and it should post it back to this page here again. And there, scroll down. There is the Stormy Skies photo I just uploaded to this Cake PHP demo. So here we've seen how it invoked that show controller, and we've invoked the upload controller. So you can see how I'm interacting with the forms. You can see how I'm using controllers to interact with forms, how I'm using controllers to interact with binary data, and you can see how I'm starting to flesh out this application. But notice I didn't have to write any kind of data access. I had to write very little code to actually get data out of the form. I had to write little code to get most of that code out of the I got a lot of functionality for free right out of Cake PHP. So once you get used to working inside of the Cake PHP environment, you can write some really powerful apps without writing a whole lot of code. So you can build apps very quickly, and then they're well architected because they're using MVC, and they're also using a lot of the functionality that's redundant across applications. So you can see how in the long run this could actually save you a lot of time if you'll actually take the time up front to actually learn how to use Cake PHP. This video wraps up the Mastering PHP course on WintellectNOW. What we've seen over the course of this video series is that we've seen how PHP can be used to build object-oriented applications, and we've seen the powerful APIs that are available in PHP, as well as how you can actually do a lot of cool things that you could do in other object-oriented languages inside of the PHP context and build really robust applications. In this video, we've seen how you can architect applications using various things like template engines and MVC frameworks. And when we talked about template engines in this video, we talked about how you can build multi-tiered applications using Smarty templates, and there's other ones out there, but Smarty templates in my mind is one of the best ones out there because it provides a convenient way to build views for applications without the additional weight of application frameworks. So if you're going to build a medium-sized or large-scale application, a medium-sized or small applications, you might want to consider just using a template engine without adding the weight of something like an MVC framework, such as Cake PHP, or if you're just going to use something more procedural rather than something more object-oriented, which you can do both inside of PHP. However, if you want to build out a fully fledged MVC application inside of the context of PHP, you might want to get an MVC framework, and Cake PHP is by far one of the best ones out there. Cake PHP provides developers with the tools to build robust, well-designed applications quickly. As I hope you've seen that already, that you get a lot of functionality out of the box with Cake PHP, and how you can extend that easily. And then Cake PHP offers great documentation on how to get started very quickly, and then it offers very well-written documentation on how to actually go about using the Cake PHP framework for building very robust applications against a number of different databases and even against different kind of media, whether it be JSON, XML, or HTML, or even binary data for that matter, as we've seen already. So With that, you can take your PHP knowledge for building applications, and you can complement that with the rich knowledge of PHP, and then you can also complement that with technologies such as HTML5, CSS, JavaScript, and jQuery, of which Wintellect has a rich library on all of these technologies. So if you're considering writing applications, PHP is certainly an excellent choice for doing that. Combined with HTML5 and other web-based technologies, you will be well on your way to building top-grade applications that are ready for production in no time at all.